finally, I would like to introduce our coaches today, Stephanie and Janet from Bridging Distance. So Bridging Distance is a consulting and training assessment company that we have been working with for a very long time in Fresenius. They are dedicated to help business to increase employee engagement, job satisfaction, and overall performance. And Stephanie is the founder and CEO for Bridging Distance. She has been working with Fresenius for a few years now. She is expert in organization and management and have a background in psychology. Yes, that's correct. And then I'm also going to introduce Janet, who is a senior consultant from Bridging Distance. Janet has a deep expertise in workplace culture, employee communication, and she also has experience in corporate marketing and communication leadership ahead of this. Before I had this to Stephanie, today is also Stephanie's birthday, so I want to say happy birthday, Stephanie.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure working with you. I hope everyone enjoys this session, and now I'll head the stage to Stephanie. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to change the screen share and let's go with the new one. Thanks, Sophia. Oops, wait, I have to undo this one first, don't I? Hang on a second. We're having some technical difficulties. Let me do this one. Okay, so yes, this should be it. Screen share. Excellent. Okay, so there's my screen. And okay, so again, here we are. This is a little bit about, so I'm Stephanie and Janet. We're really excited to be here. This is the second of a 4-part series that we've been doing with the WERG. And so thanks to Corrine for sponsoring us and a really terrific design team around doing all these. A little bit in terms of understanding the background of Bridging Distance. We have been doing this for 25 years. So we have, I started in 1996. I did my master's thesis on trust in global teams. And we are very evidence-based, research-focused, and we have a lot of fun. So this is a little bit in terms of what we do and how our company is really unique and the voice that we have around expertise in helping people work everywhere. In case this is the first time you've been using Zoom, a little bit, so your bar will look a little bit different than mine. So you have a mute and start and stop video at the bottom. So we would ask for you to mute for now. We're going to be asking you also to use the chat function periodically throughout the session. So wanting to make sure that, that you know where that is. And there's also reaction, so you can clap or applaud or ask questions. So this is really interactive, and it's not just a presentation where you kind of, check email on the side. We're asking you to be interactive. So again, so some of those norms in that we're going to be doing a couple of breakout sessions. And so asking you each to think about a situation that you have around a conflict or a disagreement, or something else that you have to deal with or have had to deal with in the recent past. So hang on to that and think about that so that you can begin to apply the concepts that we're going to go over into that. So our agenda for the next bit of time is we're going to look at each of our own experiences around conflict. We're going to talk about myths and realities of virtual conflict, how it differs from in-person conflict, options for resolution, and then beginning to apply to your particular situation. And so that will be kind of a wrap up. We'll be moving into some of those breakouts. Just as also Janet will be helping to manage the chat. So if there are questions or comments or things that you have, feel free to jump in and ask those. And we will make this interactive and make it sure that it's a really good use of everybody's time. Really excited to be here. So thank you for having us back. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is some poll questions. So I want you to think about, what is your level of comfort with conflict? What is your level of comfort with conflict? So the scale we're going to use is, number 1, you're not at all conflict, all the way up to confident, all the way up to I'm very, very confident that I can manage whatever conflict comes my way. Second poll question is, I want you to think about, how many positive conflict management role models do you have? So for me, my background, my family, we didn't deal all that well with conflict. So how many positive conflict management role models do you have? All right, so those are the 2 questions. So let me launch the poll. And so what's going to happen is you're going to, you should be seeing this now in terms of the poll questions. So please start responding to those. And if you don't see those, let us know. But please put in a number there and look at those polls, okay? And if there's questions, put them into the chat or unmute and ask them. So we'll do this for another 15 seconds. So please put in your responses. Love to hear. We have 70 people on the call. Love to get a huge majority in terms of how many people will actually respond to this. Okay. 10 more seconds. We only have about half. So if people can think about that and begin to respond, please, that would be amazing. Okay, let's do a little bit more. Hopefully everybody's able to see it. Janet, you're able to see both polls? Yes?
Yep.
Okay, all right, so let's get the polling done. Okay, so let's wait for a few more if we can. We only have 53 out of the 70. Can we get a few more folks to respond?
Who do you say this is? I didn't hear. Okay.
Okay, all right. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling. And I'm going to share the results. So in terms of people's level of comfort, can you see the poll?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, excellent. All right, so 1 is not at all.
You know what? I'm in a meeting right now. Is there another time you could call me?
Janet, can you mute that person?
Next week sometime would be best, because I'm in meetings most of the rest of the day. So.
Okay, sir, could you mute yourself, please?
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it.
That's W. Paskett.
Hey, Wade, can you mute your phone? Everyone can hear you.
All right, so here's the results of the poll, which is, so that's super cool. So you have a lot of people who have some comfort with conflict, which is awesome. What's really also interesting is this is not, so this is, you all a little bit higher than some of the other groups that we've worked with in terms of level of comfort with conflict, which is great. But this is actually very typical in terms of not a lot of positive role models around conflict management. We see this a lot. And then so we come to the workplace, or we come to wherever we are, and we have to learn about conflict. So that is fairly typical. So pretty interesting in that way. Okay, so let's move on. Any questions or things in the chat, Janet, that we need to cover so far?
Nope.
Okay. All right, so myths about conflict. I'm going to go over 9 of the myths about conflict, and then I'm going to ask you each to put into the chat, which do you think of all of these, which do you think has the most impact on you, right? So we'll do that in a little bit, but which do you think has the most impact or is most prevalent within your work? So the first one is that facing conflict will make it worse. So this idea that if we talk about conflict, it'll get worse. And so if we just kind of ignore it, it might go away, which is kind of similar to the other one. So we may realize it's not as easy to work through the situation, but what are the consequences of not facing it? or dealing with it, and has a profound impact on productivity. The second is that it takes too much time to resolve, and it's really difficult. And so, so what do you do around that? What do you do with if it takes too much time? We have budget overruns, and we're already on tight timelines. The third is that workarounds are better ways of dealing with it. So if we kind of go a side road of dealing with a conflict, then it'll go away. The problem is that if we do a workaround and we deal with it separately, sometimes we don't even know who has visibility, especially in a virtual arena. We don't know who has visibility into that conflict, so we don't know who else we need to be dealing with it. So being able to be honest about it, to be forthcoming, really helps in terms of being able to make sure you're managing it. The fourth is that if you ignore it, it will go away all by itself. And so that often we see that a lot, that if we just ignore it, it'll go away, which in an in-person environment sometimes happens, because sometimes it takes care of itself because there are other avenues. But when you're dealing with conflict that's virtual or remote, there are fewer resolution path avenues, right? There are future ways to do it because we lose that informal way to connect with each other. We lose that informal time to be able to manage it. And so it really makes it that much more challenging.
Stephanie,
Yeah.
in the chat, could you give some examples of what a conflict is in this context? What kind of conflict might be an example here?
So an example of a conflict is that we're in a meeting together. And so I can use Janet and Sophia and Karina and Ramya, right? And so we're in a meeting together, and we're discussing kind of a path forward. And Sophia suggests something, and Janet says, well, maybe we could do it a little bit this way. And then Karine says, no, that's not going to work at all. And Ramya says, we should just go with Sophia's suggestion. And then sometimes there's conflict where people don't say anything and they move forward, but they don't agree with it. And so they're conflicted around it. Sometimes there's conflict. Sophia's in one location, and maybe there's somebody in Waltham, and then there's somebody in Schweinfurt, and they're saying that's not going to work in our location. And so how do we move forward on doing something, because it's not going to work for our situation, or there are cultural implications, or we don't have that technology, or we do it differently, and how do you resolve that? And then sometimes conflict in virtual is, you sent me an email and it had a tone to it, right? It had an email tone to it, and it felt like you were angry at me, so I'm going to ignore you. Or you didn't give me the right information that I needed, and therefore I'm not going to help you. Or it is that when we were talking, you cut me off, or there's a different way forward. So there's the interpersonal piece to it. There's the fact that maybe you're not taking into account what would be with my organization and what would be helpful. And so I feel slighted by you because you're ignoring my voice or my relevance to it. So conflict, what we're using here, is kind of a generic word for, disagreements, miscommunications, misunderstandings, any way in which we're not connected. So hopefully, if the person who chatted that, Janet, could just make sure, and if people could make sure that that's clear, and if there are other questions, feel free to chat them, and we'll keep talking about it to make sure. The challenge, again, in virtual is that you don't know what you don't know. And so, Janet doesn't really know all of these things. And so how do we manage that?
Christina, did that help? Yep.
Perfect. Thanks, Christina. Good question. All right. So then the other one is conflict is always bad. And the more we know about how conflict is managed, it is more about how conflict is managed than that makes it good or bad. rather than conflict being bad. So conflict that's well managed can actually move a team and a relationship forward. So sometimes the team comes out of conflict with better processes, better relationships. So, you know, if you can think for yourself about a situation where you had a disagreement with somebody, and when you talked about it, you realized, okay, now we figured it out, we learned about each other, and we're moving forward. And in our experience, particularly with conflict that's with virtual remote teams, very often conflict is rooted in the fact that it has to do with we have varied information and we're coming from varied perspective. And when I was at Microsoft, we used to have an expression called "we are in violent agreement." And sometimes it's just about communicating and we're using the different words, or there's translations or other things that come into play with that. Number 6 is that it must be resolved right away. And yes, you want to be careful not to let it fester, but sometimes as you move forward, things will work out. And as a leader or as a worker, you have to sort of think about, will this go away once we get to step 4, or should we manage it? And sometimes you just need to think, especially, you know, in terms of emotions and feeling that. So, and then again, anger is being destructive. It's similar to it being bad. That conflict is a result of poor management. And actually, we have found that the opposite is true. Often, when there's conflict or there's disagreements, it means that the leader is setting up a situation in which people feel safe enough to be able to talk to each other about what's happening. And so that's really important. And also, you know, does that you know, does it mean we'll have better processes in the end? And then lastly, that it indicates a lack of respect for the leaders in the organization. And sometimes, again, it's just the opposite, where you know, I respect the leader enough, or we have an organization that doesn't punish mistakes, or not worry about it. And so I think it's interesting. And I know for Fresenius, when we were doing the planning for this, Ramya and Padma and Karine and the other ladies were talking about how at Fresenius, you know, conflict is dealt with, you know, with nice words, and it's dealt with kindly, which is an interesting way to kind of manage it. So, and the other one that's not here, it's interesting, is that that somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong, and that's not always the case. And we'll talk more about that. So, Janet, before we move on, are there other questions that we want to cover here?
No questions, but observation that conflicts are good, you know, to your point, where there is positivity in differences of different perspectives, helps us challenge each other positively, continue improving. And Karine has chosen number 9.
Okay. Yes, there you go. So if you could each put into the chat, that would be awesome. Which of these do you see are most prevalent in your work world? So which of these and I'm going to put the chat question out there and go back again, right? So which of these, and you can put a couple of numbers in there, but which of these do you see are most prevalent in the myths? So again, put a number in there, or you can put others that you see as myths that we haven't covered here. What do you see as most prevalent in your work world? And what are we seeing, Janet?
We got a 3, 8. We've got some 8s, 3 and 4. 3 and 4 seem to be winning. I feel like I'm a horse race commentator.
I know. Horse
3,
number 4 is
8,
ahead.
9. Yeah, exactly. 3 and 4 seem pretty big. There's a 2. Oh, here's a 7. 8. They're really, it's quite a range, really. But I think here's some 5s coming in. I think they're all represented. Yeah, interesting.
So what do you think the variance is? Is it by location? Is it about person? And feel free to unmute if you want to respond to that. Is it about your location? Is it about your function? What makes the difference in terms of what these differences might be?
Could everyone please mute? Unless you're going to say something, unless you're going to talk to
Hi,
us.
Stephanie, I'll take that one. So I think it's based on situation, circumstance, and the person as well. At least from my personal experience, that's how I felt.
Mhm. Which is interesting, Padma, because then you have more variables, which makes it a little bit more complex in terms of the strategy for resolution. So in a little bit, we're going to look at some of those strategies. So it'll be good to have lots of them in your back pocket to pull from.
Yeah, what I have observed is the same person can react different in different situation, given different situations. So it's, I mean, at least for me, it's like difficult to come down to one particular reason why the conflict might not work out. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
A
Okay.
comment that one that's not in the list is clear and objectives that lead us to work with different agendas.
So say that again, Janet.
Not exactly sure. Jesus, can you clarify a little bit?
Yeah, but what I sometimes happen, it makes the conflicts occur is when we don't have a clear objectives, and then we
Right.
have different teams working in different agendas, and then the conflict will be, okay, this is not my priority, this is not my time, and then it creates that negativity at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very common, I would say.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that clarification. Okay. So now I'm going to ask you to think about where you are and what we're doing. And I'm going to ask you to just listen for a minute and think about this and then put it into the chat as we go along. Okay. So, so again, this is going to be more of an in-person one because it's easier in terms of identifying our own sort of style. All right. So you're in a long corridor, right? And you're in the office somewhere in a long corridor, and you're walking down the corridor, and you are really deep in your own thoughts. You know, maybe thinking about business or some other really deep problems, right? So you're sort of thinking about it walking along the corridor, right? You look up, and directly in front of you is someone with whom you're currently having a serious disagreement. Okay, so you're in the corridor thinking about it, you look up, somebody you have a serious disagreement. What is your reaction? And what do you do? So put into the chat and or make a note for yourself. What do you do, right? So play this out and imagine yourself doing what you would naturally do. In that case, what would you naturally do? Put it into the chat or make a note for yourself. And Janet, if you can read those out, that would be amazing.
Yep. Smile. I smile and say hello. Smile, ask how they're doing, just as with anyone else. Respond as if the conflict isn't happening. Smile and say nothing. Say hi and start a conversation. Ignore it. Greet them and go on about my immediate business. Say hi and start a conversation. Above all, in the workplace, I remain respectful, acknowledging them with a smile and greeting.
Okay, so we have a couple of people. So hang on to your reaction and let's go through a model, right? So let's look at some conflict styles. And I'll go through them all and then we'll define a little bit more. So kind of a high level around the ways in which we kind of, yeah. So hang on a second, I'm gonna go through something else first. So the first is integrating. And integrating is basically when you think about meeting the needs of both people both parties with kind of a problem-solving focus. So this strategy kind of refers to this problem-solving or collaboration because it really focuses on working together, and making sure that that you're collaborating, and that you want to have some common results. So it has consistent positive results when being used properly. So when you think about your reaction to that conflict situation where you sort of thinking about integrating, so if you kind of smile and said hi, did you make a mental note to yourself to say, hey, I want to make sure that I get back with that person so that I'm talking to Corrine or whoever it is in the corridor and figuring it out. And so this is really, it is the one that promotes long-term relationship building. The second one is compromising, and that is really giving in on one goal to satisfy another, right? So it involves the least amount of individual loss, right? So this means that I want to make sure that I am taking the least loss. So it's sometimes mistaken for integrating, so compromising. But when compromising occurs, each party gains something, but also gives up something. So think about the words integrating, and if English is not your native language and you have a translation, see if you can maybe even translate each of those words to see if you can understand some of the differences. So when compromising occurs, you gain something and give up something. And so the focus is not on common ground, but really on maximizing goals and minimizing loss, right? So that becomes really important around, finding common ground. The third is around competing, and this strategy really produces winners and losers. And so it's about, it's a little bit more forceful. So whereas compromising may be seen as a little bit more collaborative, so a little bit less collaborative than integrating, but certainly more collaborative than competing. Again, competing definitely has the winners and losers. And so even if somebody becomes the ultimate winner, in this case, the relationship between the parties is most likely to be damaged because of that sense, right? So if you have if you really have a sort of competing is your style, it really means that you really fight for what you want. Sometimes because of the competition, and your style is you're very competitive, and it's the competition as opposed to the ultimate outcome. The last is smoothing. And the smoothing strategy also kind of results in winners and losers. But in some cases, the loser chooses his or her fate. So if smoothing was kind of your behavior, you kind of let go of what you need in order to achieve harmony, right? So you ignore your own goals and just say, what's more important is the fact that the team is doing well, and I'll let go of what I need. And so you're kind of smoothing in that way. And then lastly is avoiding. And so for people who ducked out of the way in that opening situation, really comes down to withdrawing from a situation and ignoring the whole thing completely. So again, these are the 5 different strategies. And so if you can think about avoiding and smoothing differently. So let's go back to this chart. And so avoiding is one, smoothing is another, and confronting has 3 different strategies. One is the compromise strategy, one is the competing strategy, and the last is the integrating strategy. So if you can think about what you think might be your strategy or what combination you have of these, we're going to move you into breakouts now. And have you discuss these for 5 minutes. So I'm going to assign different breakouts and have each of you just for 5 minutes talk with 2 or 3 other people within your breakouts. If you haven't used Zoom breakouts before, you will get a pop-up that asks you to join a breakout room. And so I'm going to ask you you're going to go into that, and then I'll send you a note when you have 2 minutes and then come back. Just so that you know, when you're in the breakout, if you could turn your video on, please, so that you're ready to join it. So being able to access, you'll unmute yourself, turn on your video, and respond to which of these styles you think is the most like you. At any point, you can go back to the main room and ask questions. So again, I'm going to send you off to these breakout rooms, and you'll come back in a few minutes. So off you go. Have fun. Okay, excellent. So we have everybody back. All right, so moving on. So let's talk about what makes conflict different in virtual and remote environments. And I'm going to go over some of these, but at the same time, it would be amazing if you could chat what you see as differences, and then we can have a really comprehensive list, right? So feel free to chat those, and Janet will manage that. But again, a couple of them that we see here is that the biggest thing is that it's really harder to see, both as colleagues, as leaders. It's really harder to see virtual team management and virtual conflict, right? One of the most challenging. It also may be deeper and more intense. In terms
guys,
of
reminder to please mute.
Oh yeah, that's right. So again, so it's not only harder to see, but it can be more intense, right? Because it's deeper. And sometimes the more intensity is because, again, because it's harder to see, it might go on longer. And so it festers. And so therefore, by the time you as a leader or colleagues are dealing with it, it's more entrenched and deeper. The other thing is that we have less informal time. So when you think about how many, when you're interacting with people that you have task work to do with, and you don't have those informal relationships. And so it's a little bit harder to be able to say, hey, Janet, hey, Kelly, can I grab a couple of minutes with you so we can talk about what just happened in this meeting, right? And because you're finishing a meeting and it's 1 minute past the hour, and so you're already 1 minute late for your next meeting. And so you sort of say, I'm going to let it go. And then because of the diversity, you often have broader root cause options because we're dealing with different locations. So this will never work in Concord. It's not going to work in Ogden. It works great in Schweinfurt, but it doesn't work here and in Waltham, or so all of those things. So because we're both diversity in terms of locations and in terms of functions, but also in terms of who we are as people, right? So who we are as people around, gender, age, culture, all of those things have a profound impact on how we see. And I made a note earlier because somebody had talked about being respectful, but even respect changes across cultures. So we just published a blog today that looks at the ways in which what it means to be blunt and what it means to be honest. So if you're bored and have a few minutes, on the Bridging Distance website under free resources, we have a blog that talks about some of the differences around candor. And that is really important around what I think is respectful, especially with knowing there's a Fresenius culture that says we talk about conflict in nice terms and then we use nice words. So what does it mean if you're blunt, right? You have fewer tools to check it out. And less options to resolve that. And so we don't have as much face-to-face if you're 9 time zones away, or 10 or 5 or 3 or whatever it happens to be. There are fewer options, right? And then there's conflict contagion, and this idea that is much more common in virtual teams, where the conflict, I'm going to talk to Janet and Kelly rather than talk to Sheila directly, or to John directly, right? So I'm meeting with Sheila and I'm going to be texting with her or chatting with her behind the scenes, and it all amplifies, right? So Janet, what do we have for chats before we move on?
We have a lot of great contributions here. You can't see body language, which can be very profound and telling. It's just easier to be misunderstood or to misunderstand someone, harder to read tone. And then it's harder to build relationships because you don't have that informal time of just chatting about how people's days are going. People are less likely to contribute and discuss things because of technology and bandwidth issues. Kind of just stick to the business at hand. Feels more transactional along those lines too. It's just easier to disengage or not participate in a resolution, just kind of give up. And if you have more time to meet face to face, you can see how people are doing.
Yeah.
And that just helps smooth.
Yep.
things.
So we have something we call electronic body language that talks about the assumptions you make about competence and credibility. And that has to do with based on how you show up electronically, which is a really important piece of the misunderstandings. And then the other aspect to that is looking at trust building and transactional and relational trust. And that if you have that, it kind of has a positive balance in the conflict checkbook. So the more that you can get to know people, the more you'll have sort of the sense of benevolence towards them. So let's move on and think about, again, I'll go over some signs here. So what are signs of virtual conflict that you see at FMC? Again, feel free to put those into the chat. I'll review some of these and then we're going to go back into breakouts. So not following through on commitments, not following through on protocols or plans, not following through without communication. So I promised Janet to do something, which actually this is probably pretty true, but promised to do something, and then I don't tell her that I'm going to be late on it. Or I use technology problems as an excuse to say, hey, did you not get that email? I mean, there used to be an expression, and I'm dating myself, and I can do that because it's my birthday. But dating myself to say the check's in the mail used to be an excuse to say, hey, I'm really going to pay you. You go with the wrong person, and instead of trying to resolve it, people are complaining about it. There are late or missed deadlines, which are cues anyway, but they tend to be a little bit harder to ferret out in virtual ones. There's a major change in behavior. So that means that somebody's not attending meetings and you can't see them and you don't know why. There's a change in quality or content of work. And again, feel free to please put into the chat things that you see as conflict, signs of conflict at FMC. You have blaming in an email or audio or conference call. You have people who are being added to emails. So all of a sudden people are being added or dropped. So more CCs or somebody is moved off. There's an increase in frequency. So we talk about, the email, the flaming emails, a lot of names in the to or CC, or that people just kind of, they go dark. So the communication quiet down. So you don't hear anything from them.
Mhm.
And at some point I'll write a thing about going dark is actually way back with AOL Instant Messenger, means that when you went dark, it means that your mouse wasn't being moved. So your name went from being bright to going dark. You receive something that's not what you expected. And so not right sure what to do with that. You're finding things from other sources when you thought you should have been communicated differently. So you have kind of that back door, whether it's information. And I know this happens a lot, particularly within GRD. And I don't know GMQS as much, but you find that, oh my gosh, somebody else is doing something similar. And rather than approaching it as something, how can I collaborate with them? How can we work together? It's like, well, you're in my territory. You find an information flow or path that you didn't know about. You find gaps in information, a motive or a mindset, and that people blame distance. Well, that's just what they do at Schweinfurt, or how can this be happening when we're this many time zones away? So, Janet, any relevant ones in there that you want to highlight?
We're seeing a lot of agreement on going dark, on CCing, upper management, just sort of shutting down, declining meetings, stop replying to emails, just kind of, that's all derivatives of going dark. It's just kind of retracting.
Yeah.
I have found virtual conflict can be a result of cultural differences, not the primary language, and thus colloquialisms can be misinterpreted.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, fair
So
enough.
cultural differences, right?
Mhm.
So Absolutely. So, all right, I'm going to put you back into breakouts for a little bit of time, and then we're going to come back in and we're going to talk about strategies. So off you go, and we'll come on back. Okay. All right. So we're all here. I know some of you may need to leave, but then the last section, and feel free to chat, put into the chat if you want. Any of the anything that you felt like was relevant in your breakout.
Can
And-
I make a quick comment? Sorry, Stephanie, before
Sure.
people leave this session, that there will be a follow-up survey sent out, and we would very much appreciate your feedback. And any feedback will help us to bring you better content and better workshops next time. So thank you, and we're looking forward for your feedback. Thank you, Stephanie.
Sure, no worries, Sophia, thanks. Okay, so strategies so add yours to the chat as we go. Strategies for managing the conflict, right? So meet with each person individually, and right now that might even be a 15-minute chat. It doesn't have to be forever. I think that one of the things that happens in virtual times is we feel like we have to book longer times, and we don't have those 2 or 3 minute chats, right? So we meet with people individually and we talk with them. We may do something around looking at having critical conversations. That may be another session that we do. Be direct about the signs that you see. So, and then ask lots of questions for people, right? Because again, as I said earlier, sometimes we are actually on the same page. We're just saying the same thing differently, and we're not really great at listening. So being able to ask enough questions that you can understand that. Point out the potential signs or indications. So why is it that you're making this assumption? What's happening that makes you think that we have a conflict, right? So, it's your facial expression. And again, you had a facial expression and you look like you were mad. So therefore I thought we had a conflict and I dismiss you. When in fact, it was that, this is your 7th meeting for the day. You hadn't had lunch yet. And so you just never know. So asking questions to confirm that, right? And especially why are those changes? And keep adding to the chat, and Janet will manage that as well if you have other ones.
Yep, we've gotten a reinforcement on clarifying questions, and when you start to see that the email is just churning and going, you should stop the chain, pick up the phone, trigger a meeting,
Yep. When we do virtual team building, which we do a lot actually, we basically say for a team, if you have more than 3, 4, 5 reply to alls, then have a quick 10-minute meeting, right? Or you find some other way to resolve it. Ask about what's changed, and then again, create that clear and cohesive communication plan. So adhere to that standards. You communicate some of the information more informally, right? So it doesn't always have to be formal stuff. You can do that. And you also want to have a conflict operating agreement. So what constitutes a disagreement and what are the ways we're going to handle it? So rather than saying, well, that's not really true, because we often so quick to dismiss a conflict, we might end up basically saying, well, that it gets worse because I don't feel like my conflict is valid. Looking at communicating information uniformly. So rather than just communicating with people that you talk to on a daily basis, finding ways to put it out. And technology lets you do that. Really looking at training on conflict and diversity and differences. And I was thinking about this earlier because we're just launching focus groups on looking at the intersection of national culture and technology use. And we're finding a lot of people are having misunderstandings because different cultures use technology differently. And so if you're interested in participating in that research, let us know. But again, looking at that, this idea of creating presence with each other and visibility. So visibility means that visibility and transparency breed trust. So that becomes really important. And then this idea of using more synchronous technologies. So real-time technologies tend to build more social presence. So you want to have those aspects to it. You want to have, when you're sharing a reason or you're sharing a rationale, you want to make sure that you're communicating the reasoning behind that to people, especially if you're in different locations or even different sites, like Concord to Waltham or Ogden, because what might be clear even within people in Ogden working remotely or not, that might be obvious, but you might not know that. So maybe the FDA has made a surprise visit, and they're in Concord, but Ogden doesn't know that, and so you're upset because you don't know about that. Having regular team meetings and informal kind of conversations to build that trust. So we have lots of coffee talks or team chit chats. So lots of our teams end up having 15 minutes per week where there's no agenda and you just kind of get together. Or if you're close enough to each other to have, depending on where you are, and what's happening, you can sort of step back and try to have social distance. So lots of different ways. These are a few of them. Love to hear, Janet, do we have other suggestions that people
asking lots of questions to figure out the whole issue and then meet with people either individually or in a group, whichever is most appropriate.
Yep. So the other piece of it that I think is really critical is that the assumptions that you make about somebody based on their electronic body language and how they show up for you is really important. So making sure that you're checking your assumptions about their intentions, whether or not it's because they had an email tone or something else that happens with it, is super important. And I can't stress enough how often it is because, well, you were sort of short or whatever it happened to be. And so those become really important. So thinking about these, I want you to think about your conflict situation. What strategies might you use? And then I'll move you back into breakout groups. So what would you have used? So think about a situation. I'll go back again and think also about the situations that are in the chat and others that you might know. And then we'll move you into the last breakout. And I know some of you need to go, which is okay. And then we will come back again just for a few minutes. But again, thinking about which ones are you going to use and what might that be. So I will move you in and hopefully we will, these will be good sessions and off you go. So let's take a few minutes. Thank you. Hello. Everybody's back.
Hi.
So let's kind of unmute and anybody want to share, you can share in the chat or unmute and share with the group in terms of how was your discussion and what other questions might you have. So let me just sort of say, share what your breakouts were, how did it go, and we'll kind of do a wrap up. So I will actually stop the screen share and let us all see each other. So how was the discussion?
You can go first, Erica, or you. I think what we discussed basically is ask questions is good, but at some point it's someone needs to give up one side of the other one and then pick up the phone or go around, because sometimes we have seen situations where the communication is email and the person is next door. So at some point you need to confront that person and kind of communicate and integrate and find a solution.
Yep. Well, technology makes it easier to hide, right? So
yeah.
That's the challenge. And so we can pretend that we don't have a conflict, but then it'll just get worse. So that's a really good point. So we have this idea of looking at matching technology to what you need to do. And sometimes you need higher social presence, and conflict is one of those situations. So,
yep.
Hi, Kelly's child.
I think I echo with our group, me, Corinne, and Angelica. So I'm sorry, I couldn't get her name from WNB. I think we echo with what he just said is questioning question and ask assumptions. Corinne especially talked about that. And for me and the other lady, we'll talk more about is get some individual person, meet them and understand what is their view, and then get to the common understanding from there.
Yeah, I mean, just so seeking to understand, right? Coming from a place of benevolence. And we're talking about that. Like I haven't met anybody who wakes up in the morning and says, how can I screw things up at work today? Right. So we all have the best intentions. And so the problem is that the situation that we're in makes it all that much more complicated to have it work well. So assuming benevolence is huge. How about others? What else do you have to share?
I think my vote goes for finding the vaccine and getting back to work physically in office and be able to talk to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's far-fetched, but I'm hoping for that.
I know, well, not so soon, but we can also do that by can we just spend a couple minutes on a quick Teams chat just to get to know each other? So what's the interim strategy? And can we just talk about that, right? I mean, there has to be one.
I mean, calling everybody works when you're all in the same location, but when there's a difference of say 9 hours, like we have with Germany, your overlap time is so small, and that it is like, and that time slot might not be free.
Yeah.
So then that you fall back to your long emails and email chains and all of that stuff. So
yep. Yeah, it makes it super complicated. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's where knowing each other becomes really important. I'm sorry, Michael, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Actually, something that I've started doing is setting up in office hours. I have a regular time. Every day I have a similar problem with time zone difference. I set aside an open time that I don't book any local meetings, so that if any of my colleagues that are 9 hours away, or in some cases 14 hours away, can reach out to me and I can reach out to them. That provides a little informality and hopefully more open communication than just relying on formalized meeting invitations.
Yep. Yep. No, that's perfect, because it makes a really big difference, those office hours for people who have drop-in times, whether they're your location or whatever. I love that. We talk about that in terms of creating visibility and transparency a lot. So that's an awesome solution. Thank you for that. Who else has thoughts?
That's a good idea, Michael. Just from engineers' standpoint, it's always good to have some small talk about projects, like go out for lunch together, discuss the project, may have some new ideas. With this pandemic thing, we can do maybe just like Michael said, we open some office hour group together, just do some brainstorming together, free talking, or grab some lunch together virtually. That would be helpful. So I miss that, usually go to lunch with other engineers and we can talk about projects. If there's any conflicts, we can just speak to it and much better.
Yep. Yeah, it is that. So we have this idea of formalizing the informal, right? So we have to make formal times to have chit chats, to have coffee talks and all of those times. Yep. Perfect. What else? I know we're kind of at the top of our time. What else do we have for thought?
Yeah, using the video option instead of just audio.
Yeah.
Really helps. And in my experience too, sometimes it feels kind of like old school. You pick up the phone and make a call. And instead of worrying about whether the person is actually there, you try, because you never know. Maybe they pick up. You can be surprised. And maybe you just leave them a voicemail and say, hey, hi, I just thought I'd try you. And, they hear your voice and it's informal, and maybe you don't conduct a lot of business in your message, but they know you tried. And sometimes it works too.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of that is relationship building is the business that we have to do. So thinking about that as part of it. So how about others? Anything else in terms of where we are here?
So I think I can add up to what Jeanette was saying. So sometimes a quick 5-minute conversation in the office becomes email chains, back and forth team messages. And I think Stephanie have mentioned this before, is sometimes just send them a message. Can I quickly talk to you for 5 minutes? Can we quickly go over this question over the call? I think that helps a lot with getting the information communication out and resolve potential conflicts.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Okay, again, thank you from Bridging Distance, from Janet and from Stephanie. Thank you to Karine for sponsoring us, to all of the amazing women who are part of planning this. Feel free to reach out if you want to continue the conversation. We are always willing to have chats. And again, if some of your conflict has to do with national cultural differences or technology use, we're launching research that you can participate in. It's absolutely free. And so feel free to go to the website or send me an email. And I can send you information about joining those. And they're super fun. We've been doing that for years. So thank you to everyone. It's nice to see Kelly. It's nice to see your child again. Always a delight.
So cute.
I love that. So thank you. And again, if you can put any comments into the chat, that's helpful. And I know Sophia's going to send out a survey for that, but any comments now are always really helpful, especially as we have 2 more sessions. So what would you like to see? What did you find valuable? Would be awesome. So thanks. We'll be hanging out here. If you have questions or you want to stay to talk about a particular situation or hang out or just to network.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
It's awesome.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Stephanie, Janet.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.